Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we bring forgotten pieces of American history back to life. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the past. Now, let's step back into the 1800s, into the crowded, hungry streets of New York City, where survival often came down to nothing more than scraps. In the heart of 19th century New York, before the skyscrapers, before the shining lights of Broadway, the city was a place of shadows. It was a place of noise and chaos, where the rumble of horse-drawn wagons mixed with the cries of street vendors, and the smell of coal smoke tangled with the stench of garbage and rotting food. This was not the New York of elegance and wealth, but the New York of slums, where families crowded into airless tenements and survival was measured one meal at a time. For the poor who lived in these narrow, filthy streets, the question was, never, what shall we eat tonight? But will there be anything to eat at all? The story of food in the slums of 1800s New York is a story of desperation, of invention, and of survival. It is also a story of what it meant to be human in a place where hunger gnawed at the bones and dignity was often sacrificed just to fill an empty stomach. We like to imagine history in bright colors, grand parades, fancy dinners, polished silverware. But for the millions of immigrants and working poor who made their lives in the city, history tasted of stale bread, watery soup, scraps from the butcher's block, and sometimes nothing at all. Imagine yourself walking down a crowded slum street. In the 1850s, the sun is beating down on crooked wooden buildings. Laundry lines hang across the alleys like flags of surrender. Children in ragged clothes swarm around a vendor's cart, their eyes wide as he ladles out something steaming into a chipped tin bowl. The smell is sharp onions, cabbage, maybe. A hint of beef, if you're lucky. The vendor is not a chef. He's an immigrant himself, maybe from Ireland, maybe from Italy, scraping together a living by selling cheap food to people who cannot afford anything better. His customers are not dining for pleasure. They are eating to keep alive. Food was everywhere in New York, but food was not the same for everyone. The wealthy dined in restaurants, served by waiters in crisp white shirts, feasting on oysters, roasts, and puddings. The poor, packed into tenements with no kitchens, often ate on the streets. Street vendors became the lifeline of the slums. They sold hot corn in the summer, roasted chestnuts in the winter, pies filled with questionable meat, and mugs of coffee so weak it looked like dirty water. For a penny, you could buy a slice of bread with a smear of butter. For 2 pennies, maybe a bowl of pea soup. And for those pennies, a man or woman might buy just enough strength to return to work the next day. The poorest of the poor, though, often had no pennies at all. They turned to scraps. The butchers of the city had a way of making money from waste. Bones that had already been picked clean were sold to the poor, who would boil them again and again until the pot gave up its last drop of flavor. A pot of bone soup might last a family a week, growing thinner each day until by the end it was little more than hot water. Bakers sold yesterday's bread at a discount, though sometimes it was days old and so hard you could break a tooth. Milk was another struggle. Before refrigeration, milk soured quickly, and dishonest sellers watered it down or mixed it with chalk and plaster to give it a white color. For poor children, milk could mean nourishment, but it could also mean sickness, even death. When immigrants arrived from Ireland during the Great Famine, from Germany after revolutions failed, and later from Italy and Eastern Europe, they brought with them not only hope, but hunger. Many came to New York with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and they were funneled into neighborhoods like 5 Points or the Bowery. These places were infamous dens of crime, poverty, and misery, but also homes to families who worked themselves to the bone to survive. They clung to traditions from the old country. Irish mothers boiled cabbage and potatoes when they could find them. Italians bought tomatoes and garlic from pushcarts when the season allowed. Jewish families carried loaves of bread home from the bakeries, holding on to their Sabbath rituals even in the midst of hunger. Food, even the poorest kind, was a link to identity, a small comfort in a city that often seemed intent on grinding. People downed out, but hunger had a way of cutting across culture. In the slums, people learned to eat whatever was available. Pickled herring, once a Jewish staple, found its way into Irish and Italian kitchens. Pig's feet, sold cheap by butchers because wealthier customers turned up their noses, became a common sight in slum stew pots. Street pies, small, greasy, filled with mystery meats or sometimes only potatoes, were eaten by everyone, no matter their background. Survival made people flexible, and in the melting pot of New York, the food of the poor became a strange, desperate kind of fusion cuisine. Children were often the hungriest. In overcrowded tenement apartments, food was stretched as far as it could go, but there was never enough. Kids roamed the streets barefoot, their ribs showing, looking for anything they could eat. They snatched apples that rolled from carts, begged for crusts of bread, or picked through garbage piles for scraps. Many grew up stunted, their bodies weakened by malnutrition. Disease followed hunger, as cholera and tuberculosis spread through underfed populations like wildfire. For a child in the slums, a bowl of hot soup on a cold winter night could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, amid the misery, there was resilience. Food brought people together, even in the poorest neighborhoods. On Sundays, when work slowed, families pooled what little they had. A pot of stew might be shared between apartments. A pushcart vendor might give a little extra to a hungry child. And holidays, though meager, were marked with special meals. An Irish family might find a way to buy a bit of pork for Christmas. A Jewish family, no matter how poor, lit candles and shared bread. These moments gave people a taste, not just of food, but of dignity, tradition, and hope. Still, the harsh reality remained. Food in the slums of 1800s New York was about survival. Nothing more. For every vendor shouting about fresh hot pies, there was someone boiling bones in a back room. For every child with an apple in hand, there was another child going to bed hungry. The city glittered for some, but in the shadows of the tenements, life was measured in scraps. And those scraps told the true story of what it meant to be poor in America's greatest city. As the city marched deeper into the 19th century, the divide between those who dined in comfort and those who clawed at survival grew sharper. The slums did not only smell of sweat and sewage, they smelled of hunger. And in that hunger, entire systems of food supply rose up, not from the generosity of the wealthy, but from the desperation of the poor themselves. Street food was no longer just a convenience. It became the beating heart of survival, a kind of shadow economy that kept the poorest New Yorkers alive. The pushcart was king in these neighborhoods. Imagine the sight. Long rows of carts crammed along narrow streets, their wooden wheels wobbling. In potholes, their owners calling out in thick accents. One cart offered roasted sweet potatoes, another pickles bobbing in cloudy barrels, another hunks of dark rye bread. The air was thick with smells: fried fish, salted meat, burnt sugar from cheap candy. This was the marketplace of the slums. Cheap, chaotic, and alive. If a man had a penny or two, he could buy a small meal here. If he had nothing, he lingered at the edges, watching others eat, his stomach twisting. Vendors came from every corner of the world. Italian immigrants sold hot chestnuts in paper cones, their fingers black with soot from roasting fires. Jewish vendors offered bagels and pickled herring, tastes of the old world. Irish women sold steaming mugs of weak tea, boiled potatoes wrapped in scraps of newspaper. German men hauled barrels of sauerkraut and sausages, selling slices for a few pennies apiece. Each vendor carried not just food, but memory flavors from a homeland carried across the ocean. For customers, eating from these carts was sometimes the only way to feel close to where they had come from, even as hunger pressed hard against their ribs. But not all street food was safe. Sanitation in 1800s New York was a word with little meaning. Meat sat out in the sun until flies swarmed over it. Milk soured before it reached the buyer. Water was often contaminated, drawn from pumps that sat beside overflowing cesspools. Cholera outbreaks were common, and the food of the poor was often the carrier. Doctors warned of swill milk, a vile mixture of watered-down, diseased milk taken from cows kept in filthy city stables. For pennies less than pure milk, mothers bought it anyway, hoping to stretch their meager budgets, even if it meant risking their children's health. To the poor, the gamble was simple: poison today or starvation tomorrow. And yet, the streets kept feeding the slums. For those with no kitchens, no stoves, no firewood, the pushcarts and pie sellers became their only option. You might see a father come home after 12 hours of hauling bricks or laying track, his hands raw and blistered. He stopped at a cart, bought a slice of pie filled with turnips or scraps of meat too tough for wealthier mouths, and carried it upstairs to his children. There, in a dark tenement room with peeling walls and dripping ceilings, a family tore the pie apart and ate with their fingers. There was no tablecloth, no silverware, no proper plates, just the desperate joy of having anything to eat. For women, especially widows and mothers, food was often the sharpest battle. A woman left alone with children had no easy way to earn money, so she hustled with whatever she could. Some sold food themselves, standing at street corners with baskets of apples or trays of gingerbread. Others took scraps from restaurants, bits of bread, bones, potato peels, and sold them to neighbors. A few turned to soup kitchens run by churches, where watery broth and a hunk of bread were handed out in exchange for prayers and patience. The humiliation of begging for food weighed heavy, but the pain of watching a child cry from hunger weighed heavier still. Children themselves became small entrepreneurs of survival. They hawked newspapers, shined shoes, carried bags all for pennies that went straight into the family food budget. On winter nights, these children sometimes slept with stomachs empty, but if they were lucky, they bought roasted chestnuts or a baked potato, warming their hands before eating it slowly, bite by bite, as though each mouthful might last forever. To the children of the slums, food was not something to be taken for granted. It was treasure. But while the poor wrestled scraps from the streets, the city's wealthy ate in glittering halls only blocks away. The contrast was cruel. On Fifth Avenue, tables groaned under platters of roast beef, oysters, wines, and elaborate desserts, while in the Bowery, families boiled cabbage leaves in foul water and called it dinner. For the poor, glimpses of wealth came only in rumors, or in the garbage heaps outside fine restaurants where scraps were tossed away. Some slum dwellers picked through these heaps at night, gathering bones, wilted vegetables, even half-chewed bread. Hunger stripped away pride. What others discarded became the feast of the desperate. The cycle of hunger shaped everything. It dictated when children worked, when men collapsed from exhaustion, when women bargained for one more crust of bread. And yet, within that struggle, there was an unspoken bond. Food became a language of kindness in a cruel city. A neighbor with 2 potatoes might give one away. A vendor might slip an extra pickle to a child too shy to ask. These gestures did not erase the misery, but they kept hope alive. One bite at a time got in the evenings. The streets glowed with lamplight, and the pushcarts kept selling. A tired worker grabbed a plate of beans for supper. A mother bought a loaf of hard bread. A child licked the sugar from a penny candy until his fingers were sticky. And above all the noise, hunger still whispered, reminding everyone that tomorrow they would wake to the same question: where will the next meal come from? The harsh diet of New York's slums in the 1800s was not just about food. It was about survival, identity, and dignity in a world that often denied all three. For the poor, every bite carried weight. It was the difference between working another day or collapsing, between hope and despair, between life and death. And though history may forget the names of the men, women, and children who lived in these alleys, their struggle was written in what they ate, and more painfully, in what they could not. By the middle of the 19th century, hunger in New York was no longer just a private misery. It had become a public crisis, one that spilled into the headlines, into politics, and into the very bones of the city. The poor were not only starving, they were getting sick from the very food that was supposed to keep them alive. Every meal was a gamble. Every bite carried a shadow dot. Take milk, for example. On paper, it should have been the simplest of foods, nourishing infants and children, strengthening the weak. But in the slums, milk became one of the most dangerous commodities a family could buy. The infamous swill milk scandal of the 1850s revealed the truth. Much of the milk sold in the city came not from healthy cows on green pastures, but from miserable animals kept in filthy urban stables, fed on the hot mash left over from whiskey distilleries. These cows were diseased, their bodies swollen with infections. Their milk, thin and bluish, was watered down and then doctored with plaster of Paris, starch, and even chalk to make it look fresh. It was sold cheap, and desperate mothers bought it, unaware that it carried sickness in every drop. Thousands of children died as a result, their tiny bodies wasting away from contaminated milk. Newspapers raged about it, reformers shouted, but in the tenements, mothers kept buying it. What else could they do? Bread, the so-called staff of life, was little better. In wealthier homes, loaves were fresh and soft, made with fine flour. But in the slums, bakers often stretched their flour with sawdust, chalk, or even ground rice. Hulls. Day-old bread was sold by the cartload, hard as stone, sometimes crawling with mold. Families soaked it in water or broth just to soften it enough to chew. A loaf was never thrown away. It was carved, boiled, soaked, eaten until nothing was left but crumbs. Meat, too, carried danger. The poor could not afford the choice cuts of beef or lamb that filled the tables of the rich. They bought what no one else wanted: pig's feet, sheep heads, offal, and bones with barely a scrap of meat on them. Butchers often sold rotting meat cheap, masking the smell with heavy spices or smoke. Even sausage is one of the cheapest foods. In the slums were notorious for being filled with whatever scraps a butcher swept from his floor. There were stories of sausages that contained rats, spoiled meat, even rope fibers. And yet, people kept eating them because sausages were filling, and a filling stomach meant survival. Disease followed wherever food was tainted. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, these were the silent companions of every slum meal. In cramped tenements, with no plumbing, families kept their food beside buckets of waste. Rats scurried across their bread at night, and flies swarmed over everything. A pot of stew simmered all day on a coal stove, but instead of nourishing, it often became a breeding ground for bacteria. In such places, hunger and sickness were two faces of the same coin, and families tossed that coin every single day. But there was another cruelty at work: corruption. The food markets of New York were controlled not just by honest vendors, but by middlemen and politicians who skimmed profit from every sale. Inspectors were bribed to look the other way when spoiled meat was sold. Distillers paid off officials to keep swill dairies running. Wealthy men who never stepped foot in the slums grew rich from selling poison to the poor. And the poor, powerless and voiceless, had no choice but to buy what was offered. The city fed on them as much as they fed on scraps. Yet out of this darkness, voices began to rise. Journalists wrote scathing reports about swill milk, about the dangers of rotten meat, about the suffering in the tenements. Reformers, many of them women, opened charitable kitchens where the hungry could find a bowl of soup and a piece of bread without fear of being poisoned. Churches began offering food to the neediest, though often with the heavy hand of morality. Attached prayers and sermons came with every meal. And slowly, the idea spread that hunger was not a personal failure, but a social wound that the city itself had to address. For the slum dwellers, though, these reforms came slowly, often too late. A mother in the Bowery did not read newspaper exposes. She only knew that her child was crying, and that a neighbor said milk was cheaper from the swill cellar. A father did not follow debates in City Hall. He only knew that his stomach was empty, and that the butcher on the corner had sausages for 3 pennies. Hunger was immediate. Reform was distant. The poor lived in the space between survival today and hope for tomorrow. And so they continued to rely on the street, the scraps, and their own ingenuity. Women made soups from bones and onion skins, stretching flavor from almost nothing. Men bought barrels of cheap fish and salted them at home to last the week. Children chewed on hard candy or gnawed stale crusts until their jaws ached, just to quiet the rumbling inside. In these acts of desperation, there was also a fierce will to endure. The body could be starved, but the spirit, the sheer determination to leave, kept beating, even in the weakest dot at night, when the lamps flickered and the city settled into restless sleep. The tenements of New York whispered with the same hunger that had filled them in the morning. The slum diet was not about satisfaction. It was about survival at its most raw. A daily battle fought in kitchens with broken stoves, in markets filled with deceit, and on streets where the scent of roasting chestnuts was both a comfort and a torment. The harsh truth was that for thousands of New Yorkers in the 1800s, food was never enough. It was never safe. It was never secure. It was only what could be scraped together, piece by piece, day by day. By the last decades of the 19th century, New York had begun to change. The same city that had been choked by hunger and poisoned food was slowly waking to reform. Industrial progress filled the skyline with new buildings. Immigrant communities grew larger, stronger, and more rooted. And though poverty still haunted the tenements, there was movement, slow but steady, toward something better. The harsh diet of the slums was not erased, but it began to evolve. Street vendors, once viewed as nuisances, became fixtures of city life. Reformers pushed for cleaner carts, regulated licenses, and safer food practices. The city cracked down, though never fully, on swill milk and spoiled meat. Refrigeration, still crude in its earliest form, began to make fresh food last longer. Families could sometimes afford real milk, not chalky water. Bread from bakeries improved as flour became cheaper through mass production. Even the poorest could now buy a loaf that was at least edible, if not soft. Immigrant communities also played their part. Italians planted seeds of their cuisine in the city, turning tomatoes, garlic, and pasta into everyday meals. Jewish immigrants brought bagels, bialys, and smoked fish, foods that were filling and could be stretched across a family. Germans sold sausages and pretzels, and Irish kitchens filled with stews thickened with barley and potatoes. These foods, once tied tightly to their homelands, spilled out onto the streets of New York, mingling with one another, becoming something new. The slum diet, though still harsh, was no longer only about scraps. It was about building identity through food. Even in poverty, still, hunger did not vanish. Tenement kitchens remained cramped, fire hazards waiting to happen. Families still boiled bones and onion skins for soup. still relied on push carts for meals, still sent children to bed with nothing but stale bread in their bellies. But compared to the horrors of the mid-century, the poisoned milk, the rotting meat, the endless deaths of children, life was inching forward. For every tragedy that still unfolded in those streets, there was also resilience. A mother stretching stew one more night, a father carrying home a small bag of chestnuts, a neighbor knocking with half a loaf to share dot by the 1890s. Reformers like Jacob Riis had shown a brutal light on the realities of tenement life. His photographs of hungry children in overcrowded kitchens shocked middle-class Americans. People who had never stepped foot in 5 Points suddenly saw the faces of those who lived there. His words and images forced the city to confront what it had long ignored, that survival in New York was not only about work and wages, but about food, and the lack of it. Charities grew, offering free meals in settlement houses, schools, and missions. Soup kitchens became more common, handing out ladles of stew and hunks of bread. These were not luxuries, they were lifelines. And though charity often came with a sermon or a lecture about morality, it also came with calories, precious, life-saving calories. For some families, the difference between starving and surviving was a church basement or a settlement hall. The push for reform was not just about food safety, it was about dignity. To eat without fear of poison, to feed a child without risking disease, to sit down at a table, even a rough one, and share a meal without shame, was to be human again. And slowly, this idea began to take hold. The city's wealth could no longer ignore the hunger of its poor God. By the dawn of the 20th century, the slum diet was still harsh, but it carried more color, more flavor, more variety than it had a generation before. Immigrants continued to shape the city's palate, turning once strange foods into New York staples. Bagels and pickles, pasta and pizza, sausages and pretzels. All these began their journeys in the streets of the slums. What was once the food of survival became, over time, the food of the city itself. And yet the memory of hunger lingered. Old men and women who had grown up in those tenements carried the stories with them for life. They remembered gnawing on stale crusts, drinking thin broth, boiling bones until nothing remained. They remembered the taste of chalk in their milk, the smell of rotten sausage, the sight of children collapsing from hunger. These memories lived on, shaping how later generations understood food, poverty, and survival in America. The harsh diet of 1800s New York slums was not just about what people ate. It was about what they endured. It was about the strength to keep going when the cupboard was bare, the courage to swallow scraps when pride screamed against it, the resilience to turn hunger into endurance. It was about immigrants who carried their flavors across oceans and planted them in American soil, even when they were too poor to plant anything else. And it was about a city that grew on the backs and the stomachs of its poor. New York became a place of wealth, power, and glamour, but only because thousands survived its streets on bones, bread crusts, and scraps. Their hunger carved out the path for future generations, who would one day taste abundance where their ancestors tasted nothing but desperation. Today, when we walk the streets of New York and smell pizza baking, bagels toasting, pretzels twisting in salt, or chestnuts roasting in winter air, we are breathing in the history of survival. These foods are the echoes of hunger turned into culture, of scraps turned into staples, of pain turned into pride. The story of what the slums ate in the 1800s is not only about hardship, it is also about the birth of the city's soul, written one bite at a time. And in remembering what they ate, or what they couldn't, we remember who they were, and how their struggle helped shape the America we know today.